The next one of any size, the original American carrier was the Langley, and it was a converted collier. It had been a ship that carried coal to fuel other ships, and they converted it into an aircraft carrier. So that was the first U.S. Navy carrier. Then the Lexington and the Saratoga, the Ranger came along, that was a smaller carrier. The airplanes primarily were biplanes, right before and at the beginning of World War II. Our most modern fighter was the F-4F Wildcat, built by the Grumman Aircraft Company. And it evolved along with the rest of the airplanes. They had an airplane called a TBD Devastator, which was a torpedo bomber, which was very slow and very vulnerable, particularly to Japanese Zero fighters. And Torpedo 8 at the Battle of Midway was wiped out. The airplanes were so vulnerable to the fighter planes. However, they served the purpose of distracting the enemy cap over the carrier. They called it a cap. Taking them down low to get the torpedo bombers, the dive bombers, SBD Dauntlesses came in, and that's how we won the Battle of Midway. And that was the turning point of the war. It was very quick, because it was then only 1942. And Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese Navy, had been a naval officer here in this country, in the Japanese embassy, and had spent time here. So he knew America and its industrial strength. Incidentally, I clicked off all those other people. There were 15 of them. He had said, the only thing we have accomplished, I fear, is that we have awakened a sleeping giant, meaning the United States, with their attack on Pearl Harbor. That is what started the Pacific War, that started us in World War II. And the European War up through the Normandy invasion, which we're coming up on the 70th anniversary of, and the Battle of the Bulge and all the rest, was primarily an Army war. The Navy was secondary. The Pacific War was a Navy war. The Army was secondary, etc. But they had evolving at the end of the war with smaller, what they called Jeep carriers, which only carried 35 airplanes or so. The big carriers carried 80 and 85.
Is that right?
At the end of the war, we had 110 aircraft carriers, and Japan couldn't match this at all under any circumstances. And the F-4F, under certain, the Wildcat, the Grumman Wildcat, could hold its own against the Zero fighter because it had self-sealing gas tanks that wouldn't explode. They had armor, which the Japanese airplanes did not have. But the Japanese airplanes could outfly them. So the Grumman Company developed the successor, which was the F-6F Hellcat, which was probably the best Navy fighter of World War II. There were more aces, that's 5 kills or more, were created in the F-6F Hellcat. The other primary Navy fighter of World War II, used initially primarily by the Marine Corps, was the F-4U Corsair.
I know what that looks like.
And the Corsair they found in the beginning because it had this 13-foot propeller arc and a long nose, and was very difficult to land aboard carriers. They finally did, and there were several squadrons of both Navy and Marine Corps. So those are the primary fighters. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber was eventually replaced by the SB-2C-1, the Curtiss Helldiver, which was another dive bomber. So the progression of aircraft improved all through the war. Also, there was the Grumman TBFs built by Grumman, and they needed so many of them, they contracted them out to General Motors, who built the same airplane, but called it the TBM. And this was a torpedo bomber that replaced the Devastator that I mentioned earlier. And as the Japanese Navy dwindled, there was really not much need anymore for torpedo bombers, so they turned the Avenger into a regular bomber, dropping bombs from altitude, etc.
So this was over what period of time that all of this evolved? Like when we...
1940, the war started in December of 41 through the end of 45.
Okay, so that was a pretty rapid response on our part to get...
It was our industrial power primarily.
Okay.
There were factories that normally would, under normal circumstances, turn out 8 or 10 or 12 airplanes a month. They were turning out 50 and 60 and 70 a month.
Wow, Garrett, that's extreme. And Grumman was the major manufacturer at the time?
For the Navy, yes.
Okay.
Was,
For the Navy, okay. And then as far as other aviation that was really prevalent in World War II, does the
Army Air Force was prevalent in Europe. That was primarily the 8th and the 9th Air Forces.
Okay.
The 8th Air Force was known as a strategic Air Force. It was only the 4-engine bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and then there were medium bombers like the B-26 Marauder and the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 Mitchell is the airplane that Jimmy Doolittle's squadron flew off of the USS and bombed Tokyo and Japan early in the war.
What year was that?
That was in 42.
Okay.
And that was our first aggressive action and came right before Guadalcanal, which was one of our major victories. Now the Air Force, Army Air Force in the Pacific, there were two also, the 5th and the 7th Air Force, primarily commanded by General Kelly. And they flew B-25 Mitchells, P-40s, P-38s, later P-51 Mustangs, which was a North American airplane.
I love that plane.
Oh, it's a gorgeous airplane.
Yeah.
I'm involved in air racing, and we race them.
You're kidding.
No, it was at Reno, Nevada, and other places. The Reno races.
Yep, I'm familiar with that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Next September. And P-47 Thunderbolt built by Republic. And those were the primary Army Air Force airplanes.
Okay.
And but basically the Pacific was a Navy war, Europe was an Army war.
Gotcha.
And the preference, because of Churchill and Roosevelt and their agreements, preference was given initially to the war in Europe.
Okay.
And then they would clean up in the Pacific after the war was over. Matter of fact, my uncle was the commander of the line squadron that had been in the invasion of North Africa, had been there for D-Day, etc. And we drove from Philadelphia to Florida to spend 3 days with him because his ship came from Europe to Florida on its way to the Pacific because they were sending many of the units from this is in April of 45 when Germany surrendered.
My goodness. And how old were you at the time?
Pardon me?
How old were you at the time you visited your uncle? 12. So did that affect what you wanted to do?
When the war ended.
Okay. So, Garrett, we got very lucky and met. How do you pronounce your last name, John?
Tegler, T-E-G-L-E-R.
All right, Garrett, I want you to shake Mr. Tegler's hand and say thank you very much.